Well, hello and welcome to Lima's online education series. We are very excited to get our event started here today. This is a live global event. I'm Eric Greenhagen, the Global Director of Medical Education and Training. And this time, I'm going to hand it off to our CEO, Luigi Ferrari, to open up this event and welcome our faculty. So Luigi, I give to you, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric, and hello to everyone. I am very excited to have this global live event today to discuss the Lima flagship product portfolio, the SMR Shoulder platform, a platform that has over 15 years of clinical history and a system that continues to evolve with the evolution of the shoulder surgery. Before presenting the faculty, I take this occasion to give you a very quick update about Lima Corporate and what we are doing navigating this COVID-19 emergency. First of all, I'm very pleased to report that we had within our employees very few cases of coronavirus cases within our organization, and all our employees are safe. Also, through this emergency, we have been able to guarantee full business continuity with all our production plants, as well as with our distribution through our 23 subsidiaries around the globe. Also, our research and development efforts with the regulatory activities continue to move with a very strong speed. We have achieved many new regulatory approvals around the world, and we have made very, very strong progresses with our engineers to advance the technologies, both for the joints, the hardware platform, but also through the new software platforms with the smart space that will be launched in the near future. In these last weeks, we have seen, a sharp decline of elective surgeries. In particular, starting from mid-March, we have seen a very deep decline. But what is positive is that recently, in the last days, we have seen also an acceleration and a revamp of the elective procedure, not just in APAC, but also in Europe. And also we see positive signs also out of US. So this is very, very encouraging. I take also this occasion to tell you that we are here. We are here to support you side by side in the operative room with our salespeople, our product specialists around the world to support you. Once, of course, you will see also this acceleration in the various procedure with our people, with our technologies, with our sets, as well as with our inventory. So we are here to help you as much as we can. With this, I would like to start officially the meeting, introducing this amazing faculty. I would like to start to say buonasera to our dear friend, Alex Castagna. So good evening, Alex, from Milan, Italy. Thank you for being with us. Then let's fly quickly, around the world to say also good afternoon to Dr. Kevin Setta from Syracuse, New York, from USA. Hi, Kevin. And then last but not least, let's move in the future to Tomorrowland with our dear friend, Dr. Peter Poon from Auckland, New Zealand. Thank you also, Peter, for being with us today. With this, I would like to start officially this great live event. Thank you to all the faculty, and thank you to the hundreds of participants that we have on this call today. So back to you, Eric. Thank you.
Grazie, Luigi. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate that introduction. And so it is my pleasure. We're going to walk through the agenda real quick. And we are live, so bear with us. We will have a glitch, a little delay here and there. But we're going to begin with the three presentations. And following that, we're going to have our roundtable discussion and with the surgeons, as they will certainly interact on some of the stuff that they'll present in talking through the SMR system. All of you should see we have the question and answer tab that should be on your screen, and you can, of course, begin to put questions together that you have for our faculty today, and we'll try to address, of course, as many as we can and get through them in a period of time. So with that, Professor Castagna, it is time for you to share your screen and begin our presentation and take us down a little history to world from the SMR. Professor Castagna.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Luigi, and thank you, Lima, for this great opportunity to participate into this live event. As you know, I am the senior surgeon in this faculty, and of course, the disclosure is not relevant in this case. And probably I'm the right guy to tell you something about the rules of the shoulder system of Lima, because something that I strongly believe is you read these words in red here, the nihilo nihil, that is the old Latin, that means from nothing, nothing comes. So everything that we are doing today is because something happened yesterday, and whatever will happen tomorrow is the consequence and the result of what we are doing today. And this is why I like to start with my teacher and mentor for the open surgery in the shoulder, Professor Mario Randelli. We are here together. I took his position about 15 or even more years ago, but he was teaching me so much. And I was starting with him and learning from him and then contributing to the work that he did. So I will start making a report of the history of the system that was not born a few years ago, but a longer time ago. Because in the early 90s, Professor Randelli started to have a new concept of the shoulder prosthesis. Probably at that time, many of the audience here, they were little kids. But at that time, we have the third generation of the prosthesis, and it was not really satisfying the clinical results for the surgeon. We needed to have a better design, a better components, and something. So Professor Randelli was understanding that new and more advanced system was required. And this is why he started thinking about it. And then in May 1993, the first Randelli system was completed. And see how it was. You see that we have a non-cemented stem. This was very unusual at that time, and it is becoming quite common now, but not something like 30 years ago. It had adaptable humeral body and, crazy for those times, metal back glenoid. But let's start with the stem. You see, it was not cemented, but still long. And Professor Randelli, of course, at that time was concerned about the integration and the stability of the system. And this was quite a big stem. But anyway, it's already modular. So the feature of this system at that time was a cementless fixation with the full control of the retroversion, adaptation of the humeral head, the possibility of disassembly for future correction and revision. So the meaning of this correction and revision was already in the mind of Professor Randelli with a simple surgical technique. Remember, this was 30 years ago. And of course, when you were speaking about modularity at that time, it was a synonymous of complexity of the system. That was, of course, not what Professor Randelli wanted, and with the help of the engineers of Lima, they developed something that, instead of being complicated, was really a step-by-step assembly of the different parts with higher precision and reducing any possibility of error. User-friendly, let's say. Then, after 1800 surgery, when at that time I started to work with Professor Randelli, I started to work with him in 1998. We understood that we needed to go something farther. Again, look at this. This is the original Randelli with a big stem. And of course, you know that most of the revision cases of anatomical are related to soft tissue failure other than implant failure. And of course, cuffs were torn at that time like they are getting torn also nowadays. And we started understanding that one single design is not enough for all the pathologies, because when you have a cuff that is gone, it's gone. And we needed to have some possibility to make revision in an easier way. And this is the evolution. The original Randelli, at that time, we started, it is exactly 1998, to have some custom-made implant to be adapted on the stem with the glenosphere adapted over the base plate. But there was a lesson that we started to learn from the first SMR generation, the stem. The integration was too good, too much. Look here at this example. Removing that stem was technically impossible. I mean, it was so nicely integrated and so big that removal of that was crazy, impossible. This is why we started thinking about it, reaching a new design for the stem, making it with this triple conicity that is giving a good bite in the proximal part, self-centering in the distal part that is polished, short. It was shortened by 2 centimeters. It is now 8 centimeters long, with the same trial stems and the canal rimming not required. So we started to have a sort of system designed for election, for trauma, and reverse. So at that time, the platform system was defined with the stem and the base plate over the glenoid, able to accept the anatomical components, reverse components, of course anatomical for the glenoid side, and the reverse component. An easy possibility of conversion that is very much different from revision. So the present system was described. After that, now we are speaking about 2000, about 20 years ago, I started, of course, using that, and I wanted to check every single part of the system to see if what we were doing, I was doing for my patient, was properly working, starting with the stem. This is a study that we did to evaluate a midterm follow-up and clinical radiological outcome of a press-fit stem. This is the materials in the series under 26. The follow-up is quite long, over 7 years. And these are the results. What we wanted to understand is, most of all, radiolucent lines and stress shielding. What we found, there was no tilt because it is a self-centering stem. So it is quite easy to be used, and it is really friend of the surgeon. But still, we observed here this is the Sperling classification of the stress shielding. We observed some stress shielding in area number 1 and 2. And so it is an open issue about this stress shielding in this area. However, in our series, we could find some of those. We cannot deny that, but not affecting the clinical outcome. And this principle is coming more and more out. Then let's go on the other side, the hottest side of this original design. That is the metal back issue. That, of course, had and has some very bad press coming from the United States. Bob Caulfield, the nicest man in the world, a very good surgeon, that was reporting very poor results here in the literature, and it is the design of his own metal back. But please observe the way they were designed. And the other good friends, excellent surgeons and persons, including Pascal Boileau and Gilles Valche, they were reporting poor results with their design of the metal back. But you notice it is a flat metal back with these 2 expansion screws failing very much. So I tried to observe that, and this is what I reported exactly 10 years ago, reviewing our metal backs. And the results were good, the follow-up over 6 years, and we did not observe polyethylene disassembly or glenoid revision or loosening. With this paper, what I wanted to be sure about was just to be sure that the base plate itself was strong and sound enough to accept a liner for anatomical and eventually a conversion that is becoming more and more an issue. So I'm not talking about all the part of it, but about the base plate. And my conclusion is that with the modern designs, of course I make it short, there is a lot of literature out there, is that now the metal back has a good stability, disassembly is not an issue anymore, breakage no more, overstuffing, we do not know exactly what we are talking about, but polywear, it is not yet a solved problem, because polywear may lead to metal wear, to some osteolysis and loosening. So this is still an open issue. However, this is an open issue, whatever we do for the glenoid, because even with the old poly that is anyways available in the system, also the polyglenoid, they have problems. This is an example here. And when you go to revise those, you see the bone here. It is a big issue for the surgeon that is not really willing to go to this kind of revision here with this poor bone, and maybe can be more prone to do some conversion with the solid base plating position. So thinking about this principle of the conversion versus revision, again, scratching my bald hair and thinking, is the platform a good thing or just a dream that we have in our mind? And once again, I just wanted to check if it is true or not. And everything that I did is to check and compare a conversion of shoulder arthroplasty to reverse implant, clinical and radiological results using a modular system. I did this study with other very good co-workers with the inclusion criteria where conversion is intended as preserving the stem and the metal back components of the primary implant. This was the first big paper in the literature. It was about 7 years ago, and then many others came out on that. And what happened, what happened is this. I make it quick again. I had two groups. One group was just conversion of total shoulder, and the other one was conversion of AMI after fracture because of the resorption of the tuberosities. And in both cases, it was a failure somehow of the soft tissues. And you see that time of conversion is quick, minimal blood loss, so you can save time and reduce all the risk related to infection or blood loss and so on of conversion, generally in senior elderly people. The clinical results were good. This is the constant score, pre-op and post-op in group 1. You can see the difference. And this is group 2. And this is an important principle. When you have a failure of the soft tissue on even a good implant theoretically, the function is declining very much. And of course, if you have a tool in your hand that is helping you to move from a poor function to a better one in a relatively easy way, it is something that will induce you to do some revision surgery much more than a system that is not helping you. So I was happy with the result of the conversion, and then we started thinking about new design, because in the evolution of the knowledge and the experience, we understood that, you know, there were some problems in the wonderful idea of the reverse, including the lateralization that was leading to some range of motion improvement or no, or so. And we developed larger glenosphere. Again, these are papers I published a few years ago, including something that is not yet available in the United States, should come soon. It is an all poly glenosphere that is 44 eccentric. And we published this result. The yellow is the 44 that is performing slightly better, but always a little better compared to the typical 36 that was the original design of Paul Gremont. One of the issues that are open in the reverse prosthesis is also the scapular notching. Scapular notching is, we know that very nicely, is very clearly, it is something that is very much related to the polywear and the debris that is created there. And my mind was very much excited watching this paper, reading this paper that was a winner of the Charlie Neer Award in the Academy 4 years ago, I think, where they compared the polywear changing the diameter of the glenosphere. The larger is the glenosphere, the higher is the wear of the polyethylene. So if we like to have a larger glenosphere, but we don't want to have polywear, where can be a solution? Something that is so easy to do, simply reversing the bearing materials, making a all poly glenosphere, not metal, and of course a metal or ceramic liner instead of the liner in poly that is in the typical design. This is a study that we did in our lab, comparing the poly wear in these millions of cycles. These are 3 million of cycles, and you can tell that there is a difference of 23% of reduction of the poly wear if you reverse the bearing forces. So I wanted to check also this, making a clinical and radiographic outcomes of this novel polyethylene glenosphere, not yet FDA approved, in reverse shoulder arthroplasty. What I did, I compared previous studies that I did with some co-workers, comparing the outcome of the 36 concentric, 36 eccentric, and the all poly glenosphere. I compared the results of this to evaluate the performance of this inverted bearing reverse total shoulder, and comparing my results with this with previous paper that I published with other authors, including Carlo Felice De Biase, I was in this group, and Hans Bloch, and I was in this group. I compared the results. And these are the results, and clinically, you can say this is the study with the all poly larger glenosphere. You see a time 0, time 5, that is 2 years follow-up, and you see the clinical function is very similar. And again, the range of motion is quite good and better with larger, and we already demonstrated this. But what is interesting, I analyzed the notching that I could get in my cases with the all poly glenosphere. I needed to put 0.1 because the computer is not accepting 0 to have a graph. But really, with this new design, we didn't get any notching, and related probably to the absence of major poly wear. So the all poly glenosphere can be is maybe it is a good idea. You can see the funny aspect that you have this with this implant. You are not used to this in the US, but we are very used to this. At the beginning, I remember some patients were coming back to me very alarmed because the radiologists say, oh, everything is gone and something is wrong in your implant. They say, I feel good, and simply they didn't know the design. But this is what is happening in our motion, because Lima is always in motion. Then, last but not least, the lateralization principle with the platform system. Lateralization is becoming more and more relevant, whatever you do, primary implant or eventually a conversion. And so we have this trabecular titanium modular glenoid, because it was crazy enough. We have so much modularity on the humerus side for the humeral head, and usually we don't have any modularity for the glenoid. So the other principle is this, that you can have different length to have bone grafting according to what is needed for the patient. So again, I just want to show you, I do my bone lateralization. I can harvest the bone from the humeral head if it is available, of course. There is a system that allows you to do this very easily, quick, and reliable. You implant the base plate directly over the humeral head. Then you can cut with a special saw, remove the bone that is already installed on your implant, then ready to go over your glenoid. So this modularity of the glenoid is very adaptable. Eventually you have a mask guide if you want to have a 15 degrees or 10 degrees of inclination, retroversion, or inclination, whatever you want to correct. You can eventually do this also using a guide. So is the platform system a good idea? This is a study just a few years ago, in 2017, and they included 7 studies comparing the platform system and the results. And what happened is that our study here is probably one of the best results that are reported. So as a conclusion, before giving word to the next speaker, I want to lift the ball, because I was just in charge to make a history and make you understand that what is happening today is not invented yesterday, but it is arising from an experience. From nothing, nothing comes. From people who were struggling today to develop a better strength for tomorrow. And it is exactly what also Lima is doing. We have, for instance, now a lateralizing connector if you want to lateralize your glenosphere with some metal. It is not available in the US yet, but we have exactly a system that is similar, that is a stemless. Now we have also available an hybrid glenoid that can be easily converted to a metal back if you want to move into a reverse, because the principle that we want to have is user-friendly, patient-friendly, but most of all, whatever we need to implant must be removable and you can easily change it. This was the idea of Professor Landelli that I'm trying to follow, and the company is doing the same. So this is the history where we are now, and let's listen what is going to happen in the near future through the next speakers. And now Kevin Setter will give us some perspective, and then Peter Poon. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Castagna. Fantastic history there. Kevin, are you ready? You can start sharing your screen.
Yep. Okay. Well, Alex, thank you very much. It's always very difficult following you giving a talk for obvious reasons. I want to thank Lima, Luigi, Eric for putting this together, the whole Lima team. I was tasked with talking about Lima today and how this has affected my orthopedic career. These are my disclosures. I wasn't born using Lima total shoulders. The fellowship I was with Dr. Biliani and Flato, and I for the first 6 or 7 years of my career, I used the Zimmer, the Arthrix, and the Biomet, and all those systems certainly have good qualities about them, but there was not a system that I was using which was complete. If I ran into problems with humeral fixation, I had to cement in a humeral stem, or if I ran into big issues with glenoid bone loss, I'd have to bail out to do a hemiarthroplasty, and that's suboptimal. I was first introduced to Lima around May or June in 2013. First shoulder I put in with Lima was the end of December 2013. It was an anatomic SMR total shoulder arthroplasty. So why did I change? Back in 2013, the general feeling was still that total shoulder replacements fail at the glenoid. As Alex mentioned, now we know that most of these actually fail at the soft tissue side, at the rotator cuff, which likely puts more stress on the glenoid component, which is why on these standard total shoulders, the glenoid is still the component of failure. And looking at those glenoids, that's certainly something that we don't want to end up taking too many of those out. And there were two things about the all polyethylene glenoid that didn't make sense to me. One is that radiolucent lines can be seen on radiographs before symptoms occur. And we're talking 30, 40, 60% on some studies. So what these radiolucent lines indicate to me is that glenoid is loosening. And it's subclinical, subsymptomatic at that point. But as that glenoid is loosening, as Alex showed, we're starting to erode a lot of that glenoid bone. The other issue with the all polyethylene glenoid is your initial fixation. You're standing there with your thumb holding that plastic glenoid in place while the cement dries during surgery. And over the next 24 hours, the quality improves a bit, but that's it. That's as good as it's going to get. And from that point on, it's going to loosen, whether it's a year, 5 years, 10 years, or more. But it's not going to get any better. With a metal back prosthesis, we have the ability for bony ingrowth. So we have excellent initial fixation, but also the ability to have ongoing increasing fixation. This is the study that when I'm on a podium giving a talk, a lot of people like to put in front of me. This is out of Rochester, Minnesota. And this is the classic study, Fox et al., where they showed a significantly higher rate of revision with metal back shoulder arthroplasty. But if you critically look at the data and you look at the co-field, that's the one that has the poor results at 10 years, 15 years. But if you look at the metal back near, they're not bad results. And again, like was mentioned previously, if you look at the picture on the left, that's the co-field, the flat back, and the near is the curved implant on the right side. And those are the ones that don't do poorly at long-term follow-up. The SMR is different in that it has that press fit central peg. convex base plate, and screws. Screws prevent rotational issues after implantation, waiting for that bony ingrowth. This is the study that Dr. Castagna alluded to, that 35 metal back SMRs, no loosening, no poly issues, no reoperations. And again, these were 5-year results, midterm results. So are there any long-term results out there? Yes, there is. There are 2 studies actually out by Clement. JSES 2012, one refers to osteoarthritis, total shoulder arthroplasty, and one with rheumatoid arthritis. And this is the osteoarthritis study, 32 total shoulders and 93% survivorship at 10 years. Then enters the metal back TT, which is what we call it in the US, or the axioma outside the US. And this implant, if you look at it critically, looks very much like the SMR, except the peg is modular with the base plate, and the peg can come in different sizes. So the study plan we have here in the US is I'm going to publish my midterm SMR results, which have some very similar numbers to Dr. Castagna's numbers, just to confirm that. Next year, I'll have enough data to publish 5-year data with the metal back TT. And I will tell you that the metal back TT has done equally as well as the SMR with regard to component loosening, and then eventually published the long-term results of both the SMR and the metal back TT prosthesis. So in the operating room, you want comfort. And part of that comfort is having the ability to adapt to seen or any unforeseen issues in the operating room. And these unforeseen issues can be seen on both the humeral side and the glenoid side, and the glenoid side being more challenging. If you look at that radiograph on the right side of the screen, you can see the significant medialization of that implant. Normally, your greater tuberosity should be approximately 4 millimeters lateral to your acromial edge, and there's significant bone loss there that would need to be addressed. On the humeral side, as mentioned before, there's excellent press fit fixation in the diaphysis. So this is a radiograph from a patient I did about a week and a half ago. This is a 88-year-old lady who just fell and just terrible proximal humerus fracture. It's almost difficult to even see the humeral head in that x-ray. And if I'm using a system with proximal fixation, I'm going to have to cement that in place, and that is not ideal in my opinion. The other issue that Lima prosthesis can assist with is ease of revision. So if you look at the diagram picture to the right, you can see the standard total shoulder arthroplasty. Okay, so that's put in. 5 years later, the patient develops a rotator cuff tear, and now I want to convert this to a reverse total shoulder system. We convert it very distal in the diaphysis. So when we place our body for the reverse, we have options from a standard to a small body. The small body gives you 5 extra millimeters of room, and that's important in revision arthroplasty when we're converting from a standard to a total, because generally the humerus is riding high because of the rotator cuff failure. So when we revise it, we have to get length to reduce that joint. So that body is very helpful. The other very important factor with regard to conversion is if I put this humeral stemming in 40 degrees of retroversion for a standard shoulder replacement, and I want to now make this into a 10-degree retroversion or 0 degree on the reverse, I can easily do that just by dialing in my rotation at this junction. So moving on to the glenoid side, how Lima has helped. I would say approximately 25% of my cases have some kind of glenoid bone loss. And there's a guided surgical technique, which Alex showed a bit, and I'll show again, of management of wide glenoid erosion. So if we look at the picture, the CT scan to the right up top, you can see this is a primary shoulder with significant medialization and a lack of vault. If we look at the image on the bottom of the screen, you can see a revision situation where you have medialization of the humerus, and you're going to have a significant amount of bone loss that needs to be addressed in that revision. So there are several different patterns of bone loss for primary total shoulders and revision total shoulders, and they're a little bit different. We'll show you that in a second. So for primary bone loss, This is the classic Walsh original classification. And most of your shoulders are going to end up in this B category, which means your humerus is posteriorly subluxed. So if we look at this CT scan on the left, you can see this is concentric wear. I'd say minimal bone loss. Whereas if we look at this CT scan to the right, this is the classic Walsh B2 type glenoid with posterior subluxation of the humeral head, and you're forming another cup here on the posterior aspect of your glenoid. And the other thing we'll see with superior migration for cuff tear arthropathy is a similar thing in the other plane. Again, this is what we see with bone loss on primary cases, this concentric or eccentric bone loss. When we get to revision cases, that's definitely a mixed bag. It depends on what prosthesis was in. Was it a keel? Was it a peg? Was it a metal prosthesis? How long has it been in? And what we look at is mild, moderate, and severe bone loss, central, peripheral, and combined. And obviously, we call these contained defects up top, and these are uncontained defects. And one of the things that a lot of the classifications do not include, which is very important to me, is that we take this combined loss down here where the pointer is. How far deep does this edge loss go? Your glenoid cones down about 2.5 centimeters. So is it just peripheral loss that's lateral, or does that peripheral loss proceed medial? Because that's when you can run into a big problem with fixation of your component. So how do we address glenoid defects? Eccentric reaming, bone grafting, augmented glenoids, and now custom-made implants. This is one of my favorite pictures to show the residents. You really can't correct more than 10 to 15 degrees of retroversion with eccentric reaming. And if you see, look at this CT scan, I would argue this looks like a pretty benign posterior eccentric wear. I mean, obviously the humeral head is subluxed posteriorly, but this does not look like a significant amount of bone loss. But if we add the cartoon into it to see if we were going to eccentrically ream, this is the amount of bone that we would need to remove to get this back to a normal version, and that's unacceptable. I would say that eccentric reaming does not play a very big role in my practice anymore since I've been utilizing bone grafting, and I really can utilize bone grafting because of the metal back TT prosthesis. So here's our bone grafting technique. I'm going to go into a little more detail than Dr. Castagna did, but so here's the humeral head, and this is obviously for a primary case where there's no implant in. The pin is positioned with the position alignment system. Okay, we then prepare the proximal humerus with a reamer as if we were going to put a glenoid into the humeral head. This device is absolutely fantastic. I call it the can opener. But when this implant comes like this, but once I implant this into the humerus, this blade comes out and it'll spin and it'll undercut for our graft. And we can do that at different depths, 5, 10, 15 millimeters. So here's the glenoid component, the B being placed into the humerus. We then have a guide, which is a stop for our hole saw. Here's the hole saw that we use, and then the graft is removed. Okay, this was about 15 millimeters of graft, and at the time, I would just use a rongeur and fashion the graft to the angle I needed. But now we have a nice complete solution for this bone graft with instrumentation to cut at various angles. And again, we can correct retroversion, superior tilt, inferior tilt. This is a patient who was referred to me after a left total shoulder arthroplasty with progressive increasing pain and dysfunction. And you can see from this x-ray, which isn't a great true AP, something's not right. There's proximal migration, likely some anterior subluxation. And if we look at these views, you can see a fair amount of proximal migration, and clearly there's a subscap failure. This is a Zimmer BF stem, which is easy to take out. And this is a Zimmer TM glenoid, which is sometimes virtually impossible to take out. This is the hardest glenoid in my hands, to remove without creating a significant amount of bone loss. So how I approach this case? Well, one is I got to worry about that TM glenoid that I don't know what I'm going to be left with. I don't know if I'm going to have a contained defect, large, small, uncontained, combined. So I have to be ready for anything and everything by taking out that glenoid. And then I have to address the cuff, and I already know that I'm going to convert to a reverse because the cuff has failed. So he didn't have a humeral head, so I used femoral head allograft. And I was a little concerned about using the allograft. I had the pleasure of working with Ian Trail and Steve Bale in Wrightington, and they taught me how to take this graft from the pelvis, and it was really easy to do when I was there working with them. And then when I was by myself, I said, let's just do an allograft. So that's what we did. I was fortunate enough that when this component came out, it was a contained defect. Okay, here's the hole saw again going into the femoral head allograft. This is the graft that we ended up with, and because it was a contained defect, what I did was I took a rongeur and I removed the periphery of that. So this is him directly post-op. I used a long peg with that graft on the metalback TT system. This is him 4 months post-op. He's now 4 years post-op. And one of the things that I really was impressed with was this was a CT scan that I obtained 6 months after the surgery. And if you look, I can't tell the difference between the allograft and the native bone. And that was something that was impressive. When I was in England with Ian Trail, he showed me CT scans of the autograft, and they incorporated well. And I just was a little concerned that this allograft wouldn't incorporate. This was the first one of those I've done, and I've done many of these and have not had a problem with bone incorporation. So the other options for glenoid defect is the augmented base plate. These were released recently in the United States. It's a circular base plate with the same TT metal back peg. There are 3 wedge options: 7 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. And you can have 2 options for lateralization with the base plate. Peter has more experience with these than I, and I know he's going to talk briefly about them in his talk. So I'll leave it at that. And this is an example of a pro-made or a custom-made implant. This is based off a 3D CT, and the implant is made to fit the patient. It gets presented to us for any corrections or changes, and then the prosthesis is made. This is the hybrid glenoid that Dr. Castagna has already talked about, and in the U.S., using screws on a total shoulder arthroplasty anatomic is off-label. So this certainly avoids issues. I have not had a problem with the off-label usage. I have never had a patient say no, and I document that in the chart. But this avoids that because we can cement the peripheral pegs. The other thing that the hybrid glenoid affords us is there's no chance of backside wear with a polyethylene. It's just the sizes available, and there's the mismatch chart. And I know that Peter's going to talk a little bit about this, so I'll spare you guys listening to it 3 times. And again, the hybrid glenoid, the polyethylene can be removed, and then the glenosphere placed. I've had to remove 2 of these polyethylene liners, one for infection, one for rotator cuff failure. And once you learn a few little nuances about how to do it, I would say it's not difficult at all to remove that polyethylene. So again, my early hybrid experience, the instrumentation and fixation are fantastic. No backside wear and no need for off-label FDA use. And like we talked about, the revisions are pretty straightforward. The role of PSI. PSI is available with this system. Obviously, your center pin for your glenoid placement is critical. You want to place that glenoid in the optimal position. And it also helps me assess bone loss and the 3D scan. I have used this PSI system several times, and I'm a big believer that no matter how good a technology is, or no matter how good an instrument is, it's only as good as you know how to use it. So my advice and what I do with this is I use these 4 or 5 times on an absolute chip shot easy primary case, where I know where the center of the glenoid is in my mind. I use the guide, and if it matches up, great. If it doesn't match up, I'm thinking I'm either not using the guide right, or 15 years of experience is tricking me. For any new technology, I would recommend against using that on your difficult case. It's very easy to say, hey, I have a difficult case with a lot of glenoid bone loss. What a great chance to use the PSI system. But if you don't know how to use it, you don't know the feel of it, you don't know how much soft tissue you have to clear out of the around the coracoid base, you can easily get fooled. The Lima short stem, I have limited experience with this. I put one of these in. This is actually the Lima short stem stream 1. There will be a stream 2 being released hopefully soon. But this is a shorter version of the SMR stem. The one I put in had excellent fixation. I borrowed one of the slides from one of my friends, Dr. Izquierdo, but it's certainly something that for short stem users, it's excellent fixation, no different than the long stem. And Dr. Castagna briefly talked about this at the end of his talk, but the lateralized connectors. I only use these with the concentric 36 and the concentric 40. The connectors allow you +2, +4 millimeters of lateralization. And my issue was for larger patients or rounder patients, when they would put their arm to their side, it's like putting a pillow in your axilla. And with a 150-degree neck shaft angle, my fear was always risking of a little instability because you could jump that glenoid. And since I've had the lateralized connectors, I would say on all of my larger patients, I will either lateralize 2 or 4, depending on how the feel is in the OR. And again, the SMR has lateralization of 5.1 in the 36 and already built in 5.6 in the 40. So when we add the +2, it gets us to 7 millimeters of lateralization. When we add the +4, it gets us to 9. And I did want to briefly mention for the all polyethylene glenosphere, again, which is not available in the US, the 44, there's the ability to use a metallized lateral liner, which can give you an additional 4 millimeters of lateralization. With this, I'd like to pass to Peter, who's going to talk about the future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Setter. Really thorough, great stuff across the board in the platform. All right. Mr. Poon, when you get share your screen.
Yep.
There we go.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you to Lima for inviting me to be part of the first SMR International webinar. It's always difficult being the last of the 3 speakers. I guess it is age before beauty, so I must be the best looking guy among the 3 of us. I do apologize for any overlap in our talk. There is quite a bit of overlap, and I'll try to be brief where there is. The SMR system is the earliest modular platform system, despite already being very comprehensive in its clinical applications. Evolution and the design continue to evolve to meet difficult challenges. On the humeral side, there has not been any major issues except for this radiographic phenomenon of proximal stress shielding that can be observed in anatomic or reverse, cemented or uncemented, and irrespective of the manufacturer brand of humeral prosthesis. This is not translated to clinical failures or increased revision, but the concern with regard to stress shielding is that increasingly a larger number of shoulder arthroplasties are being performed in younger patients, where over a longer period of time, it may become a clinical problem. There are different ways of addressing this. One way is to undersize your stem. It is important that you don't jam a large piece of metal in the diaphysis. the first implant that gives you adequate rotational stability is sufficient, and you don't have to completely fill the diaphyseal canal. Newer designs have become available. This includes the short stem, which I have no personal experience of. Alternatively, one can go completely stemless, and true to the SMR philosophy, the SMR stemless is modular and convertible, and the same humeral prosthesis can be used for anatomic and reverse in the index operation and for subsequent conversion. It is important to note some of the design features. With the primary SMR stemless reverse, it is an inlay cup, whereas other manufacturers tend to go with an onlay cup. It is important to realize that with a reverse prosthesis, significantly higher forces are transmitted into the humerus, where there might be a difference in terms of fixation and also integration between onlay and inlay cups. It's also important to realize in terms of matching, the SMR stemless reverse only is compatible with a 40 and 44 millimeter glenosphere and not with the original 36 millimeter glenosphere. So nowadays it is possible to perform an anatomic that is stemless and a reverse that is stemless. In my own practice, I tend to limit this option largely to the younger active patients. In my early experience of this, I have performed 74 stemless anatomic and 50 have reached 2-year minimum follow-up, and we're currently reviewing them for publication. We have not had any problems with it. We had one conversion because of subscapularis disruption. This is not unique to the issue of using a stemless prosthesis. It can occur with any prosthesis. With a primary stemless reverse, I've been more conservative, limiting to very young patients with very good bone. They're almost all exclusively young men. And similarly, I have not had any problems with it so far, but I have revised 2 cases where in a postoperative fall, a periprosthetic fracture can occur, and revising it to a conventional stem reverse is a relatively straightforward operation. So fractures can still occur whether it's stemless or stemmed. One of the uniqueness of the SMR system is that not only is the humeral side modular platform, but the glenoid side is also modular and platform with a metal back glenoid, such that the surgeon can choose to do an anatomic or reverse in an index operation, but it also aids in the ease of subsequent conversion of an anatomic to reverse when the soft tissue fails and there's instability. The SMR system was introduced to Australia and New Zealand in 2003, and out of nowhere, it rapidly became the most popular prosthesis in both Australia and in New Zealand. In Australia, the other implant has become #1, but in New Zealand, the SMR system remains by far the most popular prosthesis of choice, and that is in part because of the modularity. It is important to note that there has been a design change in the metal back glenoid introduced to the Australian New Zealand market, which probably accounts, at least in part, for our Australian and New Zealand registry results. The original metal back glenoid was an L1, where there were peripheral lugs for coupling of the polyethylene line. Upon the request of a small group of surgeons in Australia, they felt that this peripheral lugs compromised the effective thickness of the polyethylene. And upon their request, these lugs were removed to allow a thicker layer of polyethylene on the metal back glenoid. And this was the L2 glenoid without the peripheral lugs that was introduced in 2009. And the problem is that without the peripheral lugs, there was reduced resistance to shearing forces applied to the polyethylene. And all the loads were taken by the same polyethylene peg that couples into the metal central peg. So and the problem that we had was dissociation. So that we found that patients who did well initially sometimes present after a fall or an accident, and they suddenly have crepitus in the shoulder. And when one performs an X-ray, we find that the polyethylene have dissociated. And this is one of the major problems that has led to the aberration in our results in the Australian and the New Zealand registry. In 2014, my senior colleague published this paper in the JCS comparing uncemented versus cemented glenoid in anatomic total shoulder replacement. and reported a 4 times higher revision rate with a metabolic glenoid. It is important to point out that in this publication, it really was following the peak usage of the L2 glenoid just before it was withdrawn from the market. And in this particular publication, they were unable to separate the L2 metalback, which had the problem of coupling, from the L1 metalback. So it was a combination of both the L1, the original design, and the L2, where the peripheral lugs was removed. So when you look at the mode failure, not surprisingly, we can see that with the uncemented metalback glenoid, a significant percentage, a third of them, the reason for revision was due to dissociation of the polyethylene liner. In the remaining 2/3, the reason for conversion was soft tissue failure. It was cuff problems or instability. And following what Kevin have said, you can see that loosening of the metabolic glenoid as an indication for revision is extremely uncommon. In fact, when we notice loosening of the metabolic glenoid, one can almost assume that it is unproven infection. In the case of cemented polyethylene glenoid, the commonest indication for revision remains loosening. In some cases in our registry, they reported pain. It's difficult to know what the pain group means, whether it's unproven or unrecognized loosening, or whether it is occult infection. A few years later, a similar paper was published by our colleagues from across the Tasman from Australia, but it also reported a 4 times higher rate of revision for the metalback compared to the cemented all polyethylene glenoid. Again, it is important to note that in the uncemented group, it is heterogeneous. It consists of the L1 with the peripheral lugs and the L2 with the peripheral lugs removed, but also other manufacturers' non-modular metalback glenoids. What is unusual in their publication is that in the uncemented metalback group, the commonest reason for revision, as indicated by their surgeon, was loosening. And that is very different from our observation in New Zealand and from my own observation. In my experience, metabolic glenoids do not loosen unless there's a major technical problem of implantation, and in most cases, it is probably due to occult infection that the surgeon has not yet proven. The other thing we have also noticed that if you try and compare apples with apples and oranges by separating out the metalback SMR between L1 and L2 and compare the New Zealand Australian registry results, we notice a significant difference. So it is not just the prosthesis that influences revision, but there is a difference in revision rate between countries for exactly the same prosthesis. In May, I requested my own data from the New Zealand registry and compared that with my colleagues from the rest of the country, and also noticed that even within the same country, for the same prosthesis, there is a difference in the revision rate between surgeons. So what this really means is that the data from the joint registry is very useful in terms of providing an alert to how a prosthesis is performing, but it is a very blunt instrument. It doesn't give a whole story. It doesn't give you the reasons behind the revision. There are in fact multiple factors that contribute to the same prosthesis by being revised by different surgeons and in different countries. So one of the questions is that, does the ease of conversion of a metabolic glenoid from anatomic to reverse lends itself to a lower threshold for a surgeon to convert it? Because when you convert a metabolic glenoid to reverse, it is actually a very easy and simple operation. In my own experience, it is easier than the primary operation. So my colleagues in Christchurch have recently tried to look at this. One of the advantages of the New Zealand Joint Registry is that we have an outcome score. So the New Zealand Joint Registry obtains the Oxford outcome score at 6 months and 5 years for all our shoulder joint arthroplasty. So this is additional information to just being revised. So if you look at the 6-month Oxford score, and you can group them into those with excellent, good, fair, and poor outcome, and see what happens 5 years later when the Oxford score has been redone, and also see what happens in terms of which of these groups are more likely to be revised and what percentage of each group are being revised. And you can do that by comparing different manufacturers to try and answer this question as to whether convertibility influences the revision rate that is observed between different prostheses. And we can see that as a percentage within each manufacturer group, you have similar percentages of excellent, good, fair, and poor at the 6-year Oxford Shoulder score. And then if you look at the revision at 5 years, we can see that for the poor group in all manufacturers, the threshold for revision is similar. But if you look at the next group down in the fair group, it can be seen that with an SMR L1, where convertibility is very easy, it does have a much lower threshold to be converted to a reverse compared to the non-convertible all polyethylene glenoids. And if you look at the Oxford Shoulder score, from the comparing it from 6 months to 5 years, we can be seen that with the SMR L1, by the time you get to the 5-year Oxford Shoulder score, it had the lowest percentage of poor scores, and not surprisingly, a higher percentage of excellent scores. So what it really means is that for the SMR L1, if they have a poor score at 6 months, they're more likely to be revised by the time you get to 5 years, and they end up having a higher percentage of excellent scores. So this shows that convertibility is one factor that seems to affect the revision rate, especially in the fair group. And with the revision, they're mostly conversion because of soft tissue problems of rotator cuff failure. The other thing we have noticed in New Zealand is that the practice of surgeons have changed because of these earlier publications from the New Zealand Joint Registry and from the Australian Joint Registry. So one of our colleagues in Whangarei have recently looked at this to see whether the practice of surgeons have changed following that publication in 2014. And we can be seen that across the country, the percentage of usage of uncemented metalbag glenoids have really fallen because of the registry results. Although the factors behind the registry result is multifactorial and is extremely complicated to fully understand. So some surgeons prefer to use a polyethylene glenoid in anatomic total shoulder replacement as the mainstay. So the SMR has developed an all polyethylene glenoid with hybrid fixation, utilizing some of the benefits of a uncemented fixation. And through the SMR philosophy, it remains modular so that should there be soft tissue failure, the well-fixed central metal peg can be retained and the polyethylene can be exchanged with a base plate into a reverse prosthesis. An additional uniqueness to the hybrid glenoid is that it is probably the only all polyethylene glenoid that currently allows surgeons to have options in terms of thickness. We have 2 thickness to allow the surgeon to have an extra thick glenoid, and also each glenoid size have got 2 radial mismatch to help the surgeon manage soft tissue balancing during this operation. It is important to note that the central metal peg does not extend into the polyethylene plate. This reduces the risk of breakages of the polyethylene from the metal peg. And also, should the polyethylene break or wears out, it avoids the problem of metal-on-metal articulation that can be observed in situations where the metal extends into the polyethylene plate. And it comes with specialized instruments for ease of extraction of the polyethylene glenoid and retain a well-fixed central peg. And there is a special base plate that can be coupled by a Morse taper for converting into a reverse. In situations where the surgeon may choose to explant a well-fixed central peg, we have specialized instruments that allow ease of explantation with minimal bone loss. And also, when the hybrid glenoid was designed, it was designed in mind for subsequent revision to be compatible with existing inventory, so that if the central peg is extracted from following a hybrid glenoid implantation, the axioma system will still fit. And what that really means that by providing surgeons with this hybrid glenoid options of different thickness and different mismatches during the index operation, the surgeon have the ability to alter soft tissue management on the glenoid side, whereas most manufacturers only give you one glenoid that you cement in, and if you want to alter soft tissue tensioning, you can only adjust the humeral head, making the humeral head smaller or larger. With this hybrid glenoid, you can control soft tissue tensioning on the glenoid side. And what that translates to is that during your implantation, you have a much larger variation in terms of your choice of thickness and mismatches that you actually implant. So these are some examples of a hybrid glenoid with a conventional stem humeral prosthesis. Note the undersizing of the humeral stem to minimize subsequent problems of stress shielding. Alternatively, if you use a stemless implant, you can also do a hybrid with a stemless implant. Currently, the stemless, I think, is not yet FDA approved for use in the USA. On the glenosphere, on the reverse side, the main changes has been on the glenosphere in the SMR system. It's gone from a metallic 36 millimeter to a larger glenosphere, and with a larger glenosphere to reduce polyethylene wear and to reduce polyethylene wear from the humeral cup. The material has been inverse so that the humeral cup is metallic, so you don't have generation and from polyethylene from cup wear. We know that the biomechanics of a larger glenosphere is more favorable, and we have also obtained conclusive evidence from the New Zealand Joint Registry that revision for instability is significantly lower with a larger glenosphere. And I think it's fair to say that all over the world, the practice has been increasingly for surgeons to use larger glenospheres in reverse shoulder prosthesis. Recently, we have reviewed our clinical results, medium-term results for polyethylene larger glenospheres, and have noted that the frequency and the size of notching and osteolysis is significantly less with this inverse material, although we have not found a significant difference in the clinical outcome. With glenoid bone loss, the SMR has got this axiomal system that both Alex and Kevin has alluded to. It is a modular system that allows the surgeon to choose the appropriate length peg, but also there are two diameters that allow the surgeon to choose the appropriate diameter size based on the size of the glenoid. In general, for men, I use the larger diameter. In women, I use the smaller diameter. And this has allowed surgeons to do bone grafting technique, both in a primary situation using a humeral autograft, either in a simple cylinder or in a wedge-shaped bone graft, and also gives the surgeon versatility in revision using either allograft or allocrest autograft. In terms of glenosphere lateralization in reverse prosthesis, this can be achieved with bone grafting using the axiomal system. A large glenosphere also gives you a degree of lateralization without altering the center of rotation. In conversion cases where you want to achieve additional glenosphere lateralization, what is new with the SMR system are lateralized connectors that give you the option of 2 millimeters or extra 4 millimeters of lateralization. In my practice, I limit this to conversion cases where the metal back base plate is already well ingrown and well fixed. In a primary case, you also have the option of now using augmented base plate. Currently, it is in controlled release, and the augmented base plate is a circular base plate that allows the surgeons 4 screw options. It is a full wedge, 7, 10, and 15 millimeters, and we're currently working on a 19 degree option. In my own practice, I almost always use a wedge option now, even if there is no glenoid bone loss, at least to use a smaller wedge to create a degree of slight inferior tilt. A simple cylinder that gives you lateralization of 2 and 4 millimeter is also available. Currently, the augmented base plate is not yet FDA approved. For severe glenoid bone loss, surgeons can choose a ProMake system that gives you preoperative planning, a custom-made glenoid prosthesis with fiber metal. It also comes with PSI to assist the surgeon in screw placement to optimize fixation. In the near future, we'll have Smart Face, which is a sophisticated software system that aids the surgeon in preoperative planning, intraoperative 3D positioning system, but also an intraoperative sensor-based guidance system, both for alignment of the prosthesis and for screw placement. It also assists the surgeons in postoperative monitoring. So in summary, the SMR system is a modular comprehensive system that gives versatility and comprehensive application of clinical practice. Despite that, the system continues to evolve with additional improvements to resolve outstanding clinical challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Poon. Fantastic. And to all three of you, greatly appreciate it for everything you've put forth in these presentations this afternoon, this evening, and this morning. So with that, Kevin, I'm going to put it back to you just to engage and a bit of a conversation from what the three of you heard on your conversations. And then John Crosby, our marketing extremities manager here for the United States, he's been catching up on the questions. We've got a few here where I'm going to shoot those to you. So for those of you still participating, we hope you guys can add some more questions for our surgeons today. So Kevin, I'm going to kick it back to you and have a discussion.
Thank you, Eric. So, we did a flawless run through of this talk yesterday, and I had some questions that I was asking at the end, and I was told, wait, let's wait for tomorrow. So one of the things I wanted to bring up, I was talking to Peter about, was when you have a Walsh V type glenoid with a significant amount of posterior bone loss, and we bone graft. And a lot of us will put in our reverse in 10 degrees or 15 degrees of inferior tilt. We'll ream and we'll still have some superior area under the base plate, which is uncovered. And I always wondered, should I be bone grafting these? I tend to now put my glenosphere in neutral, because especially, because now I could use eccentricity, or I can use lateralization to prevent notching. But I know, Peter, you still put yours in inferior tilt, and I'd like you to talk about how you use that augmented glenoid to help you do that. It was an interesting thing I learned last night.
Yeah, I mean, the augmented base plate for reverse is currently in control release, and I've been one of the earlier surgeons with the privilege of starting to use it. And in my own practice now, I use it almost all the time, and I really only limit bone grafting by RSA in a primary reverse to the younger patient. But in older patient now, I would use an augmented base plate, and even if there is no bone loss, to create a slight degree of inferior tilt, rather than reaming inferiorly, I virtually do no reaming and use a small augment.
Okay. I know Alex is a big bone grafter like I am, so we won't talk about the augmented, but
I want to ask Peter. Yeah, I am a bone grafter, Kevin, as you know, like you are. Peter, since you have this big experience now with the augmented, and you're using this very much, as I understand, for the inclination to have this inferior tilt, what if you have a double component? I mean, posterior erosion plus, let's say, a superior tilt of the glenoid, then how do you manage that?
If the deformity is complex and not in a single plane as you are describing, provided it is not severe, then you would just do a minimal reaming to remove the edge, and the new augmented base plate is circular for that reason. It allows you to rotate the augment to place it in between the posterior and superior position, for example. And that is the major reason as to why the SMR system has changed the shape of the base plate from the current conventional base plate to the augmented one. The augmented one is now circular for that reason that you are just describing. But of course, the augment has got a limit because the biggest augment currently is only 15 degrees. So if the bone loss is severe, then you would still need to bone graft.
And then since the augmented glenoid component has the possibility of 4 screws, what is the standard use that you do with these 4 holes? There are some tricks how to manage those in order to harvest a good bone?
Yeah, so that is something that we have thought in mind in terms of if you do use an augmented base plate in a primary case, should we be cognizant of trying to improve the fixation? So the things that we're currently working through is that, for example, the larger the augment, should we be putting longer central pegs? And similarly, for the larger the augment, should there be a minimum number of screws that the surgeon must use, meaning that you can't just use two 4.5 millimeter screws if you have a large size augment. So basically the minimum situation that we want is two 6.5 screws, but ideally in my own practice, I use two 6.5 and one 4.5 anteriorly or posteriorly. But as we know, the anterior and posterior screws invariably are very short and don't give you the best fixation.
But you still rely very much on the central peg of the implant. And what about perforation in these bad cases? Are you afraid of that, or you like it?
No, I'm not afraid of perforation. In fact, serendipitously, I discovered sometimes perforation is a good thing. One of the uniqueness of the Axioma central peg is that the tip is tapered, whereas most other implants, the central peg is cylindrical. So you can go with a longer cylindrical peg. And what I observe is that with a longer cylindrical peg, if you got bone graft which is soft, then as you keep tightening the bone graft, the screws, the bone graft just collapses. With a tapered bullet tip central peg, you're actually compressing against the bullet tip. So when you perforate medially, if the tapered Axioma central peg perforates, it doesn't subside. When you tighten the screws, you're basically compressing against the tip of the central peg. To me, the analogy is a bit like the screws are the ropes of a tent, and the Axioma central peg is the central pole of your tent. But by the same token, because the central peg of the Axioma is tapered and cannot subside, it's inherently stable at the tip. It is very important that the surgeon has an appropriate central peg hole when you're preparing a native glenoid. If the central peg hole is too shallow, then the implant will bottom out and you may not achieve any compression of your bone graft.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I have the same opinion, although it is a different way I manage that. But perforation is not an issue for me. I even aim for that somehow. So there are any other questions?
Yeah, so let me give it to John. John, you've got your mic on. You want to?
Yeah. There's been some great presentations, gentlemen, but there's been some questions come through. One out of Istanbul from Dr. Bassel. He's asking. He sometimes has difficulty following his patients radiographically with the HP polyglenospheres. And do you have any tips? So this is probably for Professor Castagna and Mr. Poon. You know, how are you tracking those patients with that polyglenoid, seeing how you can't see it? I'm sorry, polysphere. Excuse me.
So I'll take that question first. My opinion of the polyethylene glenosphere is actually the opposite, meaning that because the polyethylene glenosphere is not visible on a plain X-ray, it actually allows the surgeon to see the metal back much better than having a metallic glenosphere. In terms of worrying about the polyethylene glenosphere itself, which I think what the question means is that you can see the relationship may change between the humeral component and the base plate on your serial X-rays. When we undergo radiographic follow-up,
basically the principle that I agree with Peter. İyi akşamlar Bazel. Nasılsın? Do you speak any Turkish? No, but this was Turkish. Anyways, I say, how are you and good evening. And anyways, yeah, it is true. I mean, the transparent bowl is there and allows you to see everything. You know where it is. So you can keep under control all the metal parts if you have any problem there, like radiolucent lines or so. So it is not an issue. I know where the glenosphere, the big ball, the plastic ball is. So it is even helping me. It is not an obstacle. It is helping me understanding what the important part of the implant is doing in relation with the bone.
Okay, thank you. Another question came through, and Dr. Setter, we we did answer it a little bit, but we were wondering if you could maybe go into some further detail. And it said, when you're converting your reverses from your shoulders from anatomics to reverses, are you using the short bodies or the taller bodies? So in that, could you explain that to the group just a little bit more on the differences between those bodies? You're on, Dr. Setter, you're on mute, sir.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And now that I'm off mute, you guys can hear hopefully a good answer. You know, most of the time when you have a standard shoulder arthroplasty fail, again, it's going to be because of a soft tissue problem, a rotator cuff failure. And oftentimes that humeral head is going to move in a superior position. So when we convert to a reverse arthroplasty, oftentimes you are going to distalize your humerus. And I will tell you that trying to convert a system which is an onlay system is often very difficult. It's very difficult to create that space to reduce your joint after your humerus has been riding high. Okay, you got to do a significant amount of inferior capsular release, and it's a revision. You got to know where the nerve is. So it's somewhat a difficult thing to create that space. So this is an inlay system, which makes things infinitely more easy to do a conversion. And I would say the vast majority of the times I am using a short body on that revision. And I'm not a big trialer, but this is certainly one case where I will trial the short stem, the standard stem, the short body and the standard body to see which is going to give me the best fit. But I would say the majority of the time I'm using that short body just to create space to get that reverse arthroplasty reduced.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Poon, there was a question. The hybrid glenoid appears to be implanted on the cases you presented in a large amount of inferior inclination. What's your philosophy for implantation in terms of alignment?
Well, if they were inclined, it was not created inclined by me. So for anatomic glenoid implantation, anatomic total shoulder, my cardinal rule is to avoid superior inclination, but I don't deliberately try to create inferior tilt. That's what your question is. So the hybrid glenoid is implanted the way the glenoid is. And you will notice that when you have osteoarthritis, in primary osteoarthritis, there is a correlation in terms of radiographic associations that the glenoid tends to be inclined down, whereas superior inclination of the native glenoid has an association with cuff arthropathy, whereas inferior inclination has an association with osteoarthritis. So the observation of my hybrid glenoid implantation being inferiorly tilted is not created by the surgery. It is just the pre-existing anatomy of the glenoid. But I avoid superior tilt.
Okay. How about the rest of the group, Dr. Setter?
We're talking about on a anatomic total shoulder replacement using the hybrid glenoid. I try to put the glenoid in the natural version of the patient, which is generally no inclination in the superior inferior plane for me.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks.
And if I need to convert that to a reverse, and if I am at neutral, you know, to avoid issues inferiorly, I can use an eccentric glenosphere, or I can lateralize. Well, it's not possible to lateralize with the hybrid, so eccentricity.
Okay. All right. Now this one's for the group. This is really more about bone grafting. So do you systematically use bone graft to correct version, say in a B1, B2, using the metal back glenoid component? It's from Dr. Russo. In my practice, I used to correct the glenoid version without graft or B1, B2 with good long-term results. At the moment, I have good results revising modular anatomic prosthesis to reverse with SMR. also after 13 years. Do you guys have a similar experience? So there's two questions there. One, kind of focusing on the bone grafting systematically, but then really kind of having similar results.
Yeah, I'll take that first.
Yeah, okay.
In my, in my opinion, it depends on how much bone loss we're talking about. I do think, again, I know I put that picture up of eccentric reaming, but if I have minimal bone loss and I don't have a significant amount of posterior subluxation, say less than 60% or so, I certainly don't mind eccentrically reaming, possibly plicating the posterior capsule, doing a pretty aggressive anterior capsular release so I can get that humeral head sitting centered again. If I have a amount of bone loss that I don't think eccentrically reaming would help, then I would use posterior bone graft and get that back to a reasonable version.
Yeah, there are many variables in this question because, of course, I agree what Kevin said. I mean, depends on the amount of bone because B1, B2, or maybe they are different already, and then a B2 can be different because now we have subgroups in the B2. So it depends how much bone I need to recover. But going to a more general concept, it's similar to the conversion principle. 13 years ago, I was not bone grafting as I'm doing now, that I do not do as a routine, but I like to do that now that I have a tool in my hands that is allowing me to get better positioning of the implant. So again, also the tool is making us more prone to a certain procedure that we were not doing in the past simply because we didn't have it. So it is not a routine, but I do it much more frequently than before simply because now I can make it. And I like it because we understood so many things about this version, the tilt, the little lateralization. That means restoring. Most of the time we speak about lateralization, but it is much more restoring the joint line and the optimal lever arm of the deltoid. So this is what we aim for some implants. And of course, grafting may help you in this direction. And we are speaking about the typical Grammont design that is 150, 155 degrees as a cut of the humerus. So again, tools and the improvement of the designs that we are using are giving us extra tools to do better, step forward. So we work to improve it, as was clearly demonstrated before in the presentation by Peter.
I mean, the arthroplasty choice and practice for the B2 glenoid is controversial and is very diverse. You probably find different surgeons who do different things, and they all seem to work okay. So in terms of the B2 glenoid, for me, it's not just the amount of bone loss, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. I'm more concerned about the degree of the subluxation, but yeah. also the patient factors are important. How old or young the patient is, a male or female patient, and what the patient actually wants. So if the bone loss and subluxation is severe and the patient is elderly, then in that situation, I would probably just go straight to a reverse. And if the bone is okay, I will use the autograft humeral head for bone grafting to correct the glenoid bone loss and deformity and lateralize the glenosphere that way. But if the humeral head is not very good, then currently with the availability of augmented base plate, I use the augmented base plate. On the other hand, if the patient have a mild moderate deformity and it's a young active man who strongly wants to have like anatomic total shoulder, then the hybrid glenoid give me some flexibility. And when I eccentrically ream on the high side, the glenoid becomes medialized. And one benefit of the hybrid glenoid is that you have the option of an extra thick polyethylene. So invariably, whenever I eccentrically ream now, I almost always implant the thicker glenoid option for the hybrid glenoid.
But again, the tools in your hands, Peter, are changing your decision. If you have a tool, you use it. If you don't use it. So the evolution is this.
All right.
Let's kind of actually stay on this topic. There's a question here. Is there an indication where you would use an augmented base plate versus bone grafting?
All right.
What would be that decision making?
I would probably take that question because I've got the privilege of the control release use of the augmented base plate. So for me, it really depends on the degree of the bone loss. Again, it's a bit like the B2 discussion and the age of the patient. And the reason is that the augmented base plate has got a limitation because currently the largest augment is 15 degrees. So you can't correct anything beyond 15 degrees. So if it is a very large deformity, you got no choice but to use bone graft. If it's a primary case and the humeral head has got adequate bone, you can use the humeral head. But if it's not a primary case, if the humeral head bone quality is very poor, then bone grafting would be limited to either an allograft or you might have to resort to a ProMade. Now, the other thing is the age of the patient. So what I tend to do now is for elderly patient where the humeral head is not very good and where there is minimal bone loss, just to create a bit of inferior tilt, I would use the augmented base plate. But if the bone quality of the humeral head is very good and the patient is young and the glenoid neck is short, that is the situation where I would still do a bio-RSA. So in summary, young patient, I bone graft, old patient, I use augmented base plate.
Okay, great. Another question. In my practice, in most cases, the central post of the metal back breaks through the anterior and posterior scapular neck, and I'm afraid of fracturing it. Any tips? Again, this is for the group.
I can take that question. So the central peg will perforate based on several factors. In a primary case, if you're not excessively medialized in a native glenoid, then the commonest reason for perforation of a central peg, if you use a short central peg, is that probably your entry point to the glenoid may be a little bit too anterior. There is a tendency that when you do anatomic total shoulder replacement for the glenoid to be a little bit too anterior, with a delta pectoral approach, it's a little bit more difficult to be truly centered. Now, if you use a very long central peg, it will perforate no matter what. So even if you are technically correct, if the central peg is very long, it will eventually be long enough to perforate. But if your central peg is not long, you're more likely to perforate if the entry point is anterior or if your glenoid is excessively retroverted. So those are the only two explanations of why you would perforate when you're not using a long central peg. And Kevin alluded to this, where a simple technique is that in many systems, the glenoid rimming guide works over a central guide wire. And I teach my residents and fellows, once you implant the guide wire into the native glenoid, just to palpate where it perforates across the front of the glenoid. If it perforates very, very early, and it is a very short distance from the anterior wall, then when you put the central peg in, you will probably be very likely to perforate. And another trick you could do is once you put the guide wire in, you can remove the guide wire and use an AO depth gauge to measure that depth of that hole. And then you can reinsert the guide wire. It will always follow the same hole you already made.
Any other comments from Professor Castagna or Dr. Setter?
No, of course, these are the basic principles, and Peter described this very clearly.
Okay, here's a question on indications for reverse total shoulder in a younger patient. Muscle I can't even talk. Atrophy, B2, B3. What are those indications when you've got that sort of defect, maybe even combined with some muscle issues?
Kevin, you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, it depends on what we're talking about in terms of young patient. Are we talking 50? Are we talking 60? I have a tendency, if you look at my split on anatomic shoulder replacements and reverse shoulder replacements early in my career, and I started in 2004, just when they became FDA approved in the United States, it was probably 90-10. And now it's not the opposite. It's not 10-90, but I'd say it's probably 65-70% reverse, 30% anatomic. And so if I have a patient who's 58, and age is a number. I have patients who are 58 who are physiologically 70. I have patients who are 70 who are physiologically 55. But if I have a patient who is physiologically or numerically young, but they have a Walsh B2 glenoid with bone erosion, I think Peter hit it on the nose before, and they have 80%, 90% posterior subluxation, I think it's pretty well shown that if you follow patients out on a standard total shoulder replacement, they're going to have posterior subluxation within 2 years. So I'm more apt to put a reverse in someone with the Walsh B2 with significant, say 80+% posterior subluxation. When I give some talks and I talk to the residents, I say, the indications for the reverse have really, really grown. And originally it was designed for cuff tear arthropathy. And if you look at the results, they're best for cuff tear arthropathy. Now we have 4-part proximal humerus fractures, irreparable rotator cuffs. And now we even have 2 indications to do a reverse shoulder replacement with an intact cuff. And one are these posterior subluxation, Walsh B2, 2+ glenoids, and patients, say, who are over 75 years old, who have, just muscle atrophy. So now we're looking at doing reverses on intact cuffs. So the indications have certainly exploded. So I would say if I have a patient with significant posterior wear, 58 years old, we're not talking about a laborer or someone like that. I have a low trigger to do a reverse arthroplasty.
Yeah, exactly the same points. The evolution of the indication is raising very much. Of course, we must be careful not to be too much aggressive, but Kevin listed all the major issues. Number 1, define what is young. Number 2, it is very important to look to 2 sides, the bone. So the static posterior subluxation is an enemy of any other treatment, or the absence of good soft tissues. So you put all this together, the patient, the anatomy, taking the bone and the soft tissue, and then you take your decision what is the best to provide good function and relief of pain.
All right. Now this is a kind of a hot topic as well. What are your concerns, or do you have concerns about the superior glenoid base plate screw type, whether it's a cortical or cancellous, in terms of preventing scapular spine fractures?
Well, using the SMR metal back, the screws, we clearly demonstrated this, are just for early stability, not for the future, just in the early phases to prevent any rotation. So personally, I do not use very long screws. On a standard case, I stay on 20-25, and that's it. Just aiming a little bit on top to the base of the coracoid, but not too long. This is my personal philosophy, and I'm happy to listen to the other friends in the faculty.
Yeah, that's my philosophy as well. You never say never, never say always. But using a 25, 30, 20, 25, 20 to 30 millimeter screw, I've never had a problem with any scapular fracture. The only issue I've ever had with a scapular fracture was, on a custom-made implant where we're looking to get fixation and the, superior screws are going, 50 millimeters. That's the only issue I've ever had with a spine fracture. But I think if you keep the screws at a reasonable length, you're not gonna have that issue. And again, these screws are made for rotational control while we're waiting for bony ingrowth.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but for fixation of the base plate in a primary reverse, it's important not to tilt the base plate up. You could argue whether it should be a neutral or how much you tilt down. In terms of screw options, the screw placement, in my mind, provided the base plate is not tilted up, the most important screw is probably the inferior screw. And it's very important that you place the inferior screw. It is into the thick ridge of bone along the inferior scapular neck. The inferior screw is what will resist tensioning forces as the base plate tries to distract with shear forces. The superior screw is not that important because the superior base plate will naturally want to compress when you apply a shear load on the base plate. And the superior screw is really only for rotational and supplementary stability. So in my mind, the inferior screw is more important than the superior screw. And in the superior screw, I teach my residents to be aware of any screw that's longer than 25. The average distance to the suprascapular notch is approximately 25 millimeters.
A question came in about lateralization. And so we have the lateralization through the taper in 2 millimeters or 4 millimeters, but now with the new base plate, we have the option of doing a 2 millimeter or 4 millimeter on the new augmented base plate. Is there, what's your decision-making process? How do you decide which one to use? Mr. Poon, I think this is kind of directed to you right now because you've used the base plates, and then maybe Dr. Setter because you've used the connectors.
I mean, the option of lateralization is a little bit complicated. You can lateralize the entire construct on the humeral side, or you can lateralize the entire construct on the glenoid side. You're going to be very careful about excessive lateralization on both sides. Now, on the glenoid side, there are different points of lateralization. The SMR system, by the fact that the base plate is curved, has already got a degree of lateralization in a curved back base plate compared to a flat back base plate. And then when you add the augment on top of that, that is why the augment lateralization is limited to only 2 and 4 millimeters. Whereas other manufacturers, where the base plate is flat, they actually have the option of 6 or 8 millimeters. So with a curved back, it's already 3.8 millimeter lateralized, and we need to add 2 and 4 on top of a curved back base plate. Now, how do I decide? I look at the inferior glenoid neck length. So if the inferior glenoid neck length is less than 1 centimeter, then I would lateralize on either the base plate if it's an elderly patient, or I would do a bio-RSA if it's a younger patient and the humeral head autograft is of good quality. The other situation where I will lateralize on the base plate or bone graft is if there's excessive medialized wear. So what you want is for the base plate to be approximately 8 to 10 millimeters lateral to the coracoid by the time you finish with the operation. So a lot of it depends on what you begin with on the glenoid side.
John, it's Eric. I'm just going to just chime in. We're getting towards the end here of our session, and just have we're going to get 2 more questions in, and then we're going to how quickly we'll wrap it up and close out our session. So, John, 2 more questions, please.
Yeah, this one, Dr. Setter, this one's for you. How are you combating the expense of ProMade within U.S. hospitals? I know you've done a few ProMades, and what's kind of been the challenges?
Yeah, before ProMade was around, I was using the VRS as well, and I fortunately have not had an issue with my hospital denying any of these prostheses. I certainly am not doing anything special that I could give any advice on. I guess I'm just lucky that I'm at a hospital where they haven't given me a hard time about using these.
Okay. Is there a way to fix a metaphysis fracture below a stemless humeral component and anatomic total shoulder without revising the stem prosthesis? Let me see, hold on. I think this is in reference of maybe a non-displaced metaphyseal fracture with a placed stemmed component. I hope that's what the question was.
Sorry, can you repeat that question? You talk about stemless or stem?
Yes. Is there a way to fix a metaphysis fracture below a stemless humeral component in an anatomic shoulder without revising it to a stemmed prosthesis.
So you're talking about a humeral fracture below a stemless humeral component.
Yes, sir.
Right. I'm not, well, I've had 2 fractures, and there are factors to involve. Ultimately, you could ask yourself, have you got adequate bone in the proximal humerus to achieve meaningful fixation? It's very difficult when you got a prosthesis in the proximal metaphysis to get adequate bone. But I guess if you got an undersized humeral core with a thick surrounding bone, you may be able to fix it. But in my case, I haven't been confident enough to think that I could achieve adequate fixation. I'd be more assured by just simply revising it to a stemmed implant. And it's not a difficult operation to do.
Right. Yeah, I mean, maybe if it were minor and non-displaced, maybe.
Well, if it's non-displaced, then you can treat it like any other non-displaced fracture.
Mm-hmm.
That is, you treat it without an operation.
Yeah.
Eric, that was our 2 questions.
Yes, John, thank you very much for moderating through all the questions, and greatly appreciate it. I know we probably missed a few, and we'll work to respond to those as we can identify some of the folks that put those on. To the surgeons, I just truly want to thank you again for your time on this great first adventure into the world of virtual type of education for us in our Lima online education. So these are special times for all of us, and we're certainly going to continue to work through those. For many in the world, we do know that this is a celebration on this May 8th VE Day, when the world did combat a different type of enemy back in the day, 75 years ago. And we're truly going to make the changes that we need to move forward together. And Lima is going to be right there with you all the way. So again, Professor Castagna, Dr. Kevin Sutter, and Mr. Peter Poon, I thank you graciously from all of us at Lima for this great event today. Full 2 hours for all of our attendees that joined us today. Thank you very much for being a part of this. We greatly appreciate your time to spend with us.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Good night, everyone, or have a good day, whatever it is. Ciao, ciao. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Take care.